So Senator Heffernan then, with his Rural and Regional Affairs and Transport References Committee, took on foreign investment and the national interest, trying to work out what we do with the definition. I mean, that committee took a very long time to report. Every time there was something new that they discovered, which to be honest had been in the legislation or the policy for quite some time, they got another extension. The most recent one, of course, that caused an extension was when the WA government and the Order 2 scheme got into bed with a Chinese hotel company to develop the agricultural works up there. Senator Heffernan suddenly discovered that there was an exception in the legislation that allows for a state government to deal with private foreign investors without going through Canberra. So another delay to the committee. But basically, we had that committee coming up with an answer that general recognition of a need for foreign investment. It's very clear we do need foreign investment in Australian agriculture. I was at a function recently where a banker described Australia's problem with getting funds internally to go into agriculture. And he summarised it by saying, look, someone's got an auntie or an uncle who went into some form of agribusiness, a dairy farm, and within a very short period of time was stone motherless broke. And he said, then also imagine you're the person who's been appointed to go and report to your foreign investment master about what's happening on the ground. We've had a drought. There was a flood this year. The locusts got us. There was a fire. And then finally, hey, we broke even. So it's a challenge, really, in the agri-space in Australia, and Australians know that. So funds are not necessarily putting in where we perhaps ought to be seeing them. So we get to the end of Senator Heffernan and his committee, which is reporting rather politically just close to an election, of course. But we have public concern reaching a point where FIRB and our day-to-day dealings with FIRB was very closely scrutinising anything that had even a remote rural connection. So we're getting strange questions about water rights and if you buy an orchard, would you sell off your water rights? Says, well, no, you need to water your plants. So FIRB was starting to learn. They were starting to try and get some information, particularly in matters where there was just any connection to the rural space. And then finally, we get to a point, as I said, a very political point, and it's something that all foreign investors anywhere should be very wary of when investing in another country, and that is ADM started its takeover bid in an election year. There quite simply are no votes lost in kicking foreigners. It gives the Treasurer or the deciding minister a very free kick. You stand up, hand on heart, and say, I am protecting the national interest. Costello did that in 2001 in the election year with Shell and Woodside. You look overseas, if you look at the BHP potash decision in Canada, have a look for the election. It was a very important election in Saskatchewan at the time where the potash were located that the federal government needed to get some support through. So always look out for the election. And so that's what ADM walks into. So they come into a FIRB process where there's a background of heightened sensitivity to rural investment. Now, unfortunately, then again, looking from the outside, it appears that ADM took the view that as GrainCorp is listed, its shares are for sale, all they need to do is conduct a takeover process in a mature market such as Australia, and not unlike the United States, and away you go. They did not read the market and read what was happening in the rural space well. Now, ADM does have a checkered past. That was played on, even though it was some time ago. But those who were dead against the proposal and were concerned, there were some that were either dead against the proposal or were looking to try and get through the GrainCorp supposed monopoly on the East Coast. And they well and truly played on the demons of ADM's past in Canberra. So you then combine ADM's history with GrainCorp's near monopoly on the East Coast, and you have a recipe for national interest concern. And look, much has been said about what's happened with ADM in their lack of real engagement on the ground, when they were really looking at it from a shareholder perspective. They really didn't. They tried at some point, but they really didn't get that traction with the growers. the apparent fly-in, fly-out nature of the early path of the takeover with some ADM folk coming across to Australia. They weren't positioned here. They didn't show a commitment here. And eventually, when there were obvious concerns with the process taking longer than thought, the fly-in, fly-out looked more like a panic stations rather than any true engagement. So where you do have a matter that you do have very clear national interest concern, I mean, there's no magic to national interest. It's not defined, and it should never be defined. I'm very passionate about that because it allows us to have flexibility in looking at who's coming into the country and who's buying what assets. As much as my colleagues would disagree with me, if you do define something, then you get some very smart lawyers who can work a way around it. So far better to have the flexibility. So when you see that national interest concern, and it's a practice that I have, if we've got something that has got problems, then it's absolutely appropriate to engage a good lobbyist and appropriately a media advisor who's going to guide you on dealing with those, the naysayers, and getting your message out. It's well known that Helen Coonan and John Dawkins at GRA were the main lobbyists. And look, both those were former ministers in former Liberal and Labor governments. At the end of the day, a lot of the feedback simply questions whether they had sufficient agricultural weight to be credible and to actually sell the ADM story in Canberra. And then we have also this issue, I don't know what precisely happened, but it is relatively rare for lobbying efforts to be expressly condemned by ministers or members of parliament, except for Senator Xenophon, he's always had a problem with it. But in the ADM story, we have Senator Heffernan openly criticising the lobbyists, their long lunches, and who knows what happened in New York. But something quite seriously happened in New York when Treasurer Hockey was pretty much harassed and harangued by the lobbying efforts there, and that really sounded negatively for ADM. He was very unimpressed with the pursuit of him in that city. So who knows what it was, but it certainly did not do ADM any favours. Because what you do is you engage the lobbyist to sell the message in Canberra, not necessarily in New York. It just doesn't seem to have happened appropriately. And certainly the message did not cut through. Similarly with your media advisor. Clear, consistent strategy with a key messaging, and keep repeating that, is required. Yeah. ADM had some good things to say. Right at the very end, they actually promised some extra couple $100 million worth of infrastructure development. That's not going to happen. I think we've seen GrainCorp recently, and I'll be corrected by the GrainCorp people here, talking about closures. It's a far cry from having infrastructure put in, now having closures. They didn't get their message across. And it was drowned by the naysayers. Now, for the statistically minded, a friend of mine was is a journo and up at Parliament House, and he told me that from a political perspective, there were 321 media mentions in newspapers, 92 radio and television current affairs programs, and 24 press releases. Pretty much all of them were against ADM. They really weren't getting their story through. But what was happening in Canberra was there were a number of lobbyists for various interests crawling all over Parliament House. I had hedge funds would call me and ask for my view. What did I think would happen? I mean, I can only speak from the outside, as I've said. Colleagues in the journos would ring and try and get a view and try and predict what would be happening. But it was very, very hard to try and figure out which way the treasurers would jump. Now, I say treasurers because you've got to remember, this was in front of 3 different treasurers. Not many applications get that distinction. Started with Swan, Bowen had it, and Bowen went, here's a hot potato, straight into Hockey's lap. There was no way known Bowen was going to make a decision on that when he had the opportunity, when he could see the division on the Conservative side. That was just a little time bomb that he just threw over the fence. So it was never going to happen. But yeah, perhaps Swan could have done something. And when we talk about that, with going through 3 treasurers, the FIRB timing is something that is often discussed.